welcome everyone to this evening's event. My name is Chris. I am going to be hosting the event this evening. Not hosting, I'm going to be chairing the event this evening. Festival Ideas is hosting the event, obviously. I'm here to make introductions, to run the Q&A at the end of the session. But otherwise, as I said, my name is Chris. I am a freelance science communicator based here in York, and I've known this evening's speaker for a number of years now. And I've had the great joy of chairing a number of his sessions. And the joy comes partly from my job's really, really easy, because he makes it so easy. He gives a great talk and generally leads to loads of questions which he answers in a very entertaining way. And so it's very easy for me to do. But it's also entertaining because he just picks some fascinating topics. He's a bit of a polymath in some ways. James Lees, Dr. James Lees, is an associate lecturer in the University of York's School of Physics, Engineering and Technology. He's done work in astrophysics, in medical physics, in condensed matter physics, done loads of stuff, but in his copious spare time, when he's not doing that, he has written books. He's got a long history of science communication projects, events, all sorts of stuff. And whenever a festival like this comes along, he's the first person to put up his hand and say, heck yeah, I will come and speak to people about whatever's on my mind this week. And this week, on James's mind, is the topic of memory. And I was really happy when I saw this because I thought, God knows in my 50s I'm really going to need this. But it wasn't about how Chris can help himself to remember the things that keep falling out of his head. Instead, it was about the memory that we all increasingly depend on in storing our data. Very, very quick anecdote before I hand over to James. I did my PhD I finished in 2000, which I don't know if there's anyone here in the room who was born post-2000. But in 2000, I was working with data files in theoretical particle physics, which blew my mind because they were 1 gigabyte in size. It's like, people can't work at that speed. That's insane. There's no way that you can deal with that amount of data. I can take a photograph on my phone or a bit of video on my phone now, which wipes that away. We've trivialized the concept of billions of bits of data now. It's just, we just throw it around. How do we deal with that? Well, with any luck this evening, Dr. James Lees will give us some hope of understanding. Would you please make him very welcome, Dr. James Lees.
Thank you very much, Chris. Good evening, good afternoon, everybody. First of all, quick apologies. I've had a bit of a cold, so A, I'm about half a register below where I normally am, and B, my voice might get a little bit croaky towards the end, so I hope you can forgive me for that. Now, as Chris said, I am here today to discuss the question of how do we remember everything? How is it that we can store the huge amounts of data that we create and use in our modern world? Now, the first way we need to think about this is how physically do we store that data? How do we do it? And we've moved on a little bit. We used to store it, of course, as writing. We used to store it as books. We used to store it in 1,000,001 different forms. But we've changed now to pretty much exclusively storing it as bits. And we need to ask the question, what is a bit? What is it that a bit looks like? And you're possibly familiar with them looking like this. Here we are. It's a bunch of zeros and a bunch of ones. Okay? That's a good start, but what does that actually mean? Well, we can define these as an on or an off state. And that's quite important, because what we're actually talking about here, what we're talking about when we think about the binary system, binary standing for 2, is we are not talking about any one particular thing. We are talking about anything where we have just 2 possible states. And that's important, because that means we can play around with a lot of different things. And we'll get to that a little bit in the future, but the question really is, okay, well, what can we do with this? This is effectively an entirely separate form of mathematics. The mathematics that you're used to has 10 different digits in it, 1 to 9 and 0. This is a form of mathematics that has only 2 digits, a 0 and a 1. So the question we might ask then is, well, 0 and 1 isn't particularly useful. How do we turn this into bigger numbers? Because bigger numbers are more useful. Well, it's quite simple. It's a bit like this. What happens is, every number that we can't make with all of the numbers previously is the new number. So our first one, if it's a 1, it is a 1. And if it's a 0, then it's 0. But the next number stands for 2, because that's the next number up. So if you want to make 2, you have a 1 in that slot. If you want to make 3, you add those two together. You have a 2 plus a 1 makes a 3. And then the next number you can't make is a 4, so your next digit is the 4 digit, and so on and so on. So if we take this number that we have here, we have a digit in the 64th place, we have a digit in the 16th, a digit in the 4th, and a digit in the 1st place. So we can add all of these numbers together, and that gives us a bigger number. So by taking a series of these very simple binary states, we add them together to make that number. So with only 8 different digits here, we can create the number 85. Now, that might not sound very impressive. Well, clearly we can make the number 85 with just 2 digits, rather than having to use 8 different digits. Why is binary better? The question, of course, is not how many digits are we actually using, but how many digits might we have to use? See, when we give a 2-digit number in our numeric system, we're not using 2 digits. We're using 20 possible digits. Because if we want to store a state, that 5 could be 10 different numbers. That 8 could be 10 different numbers. Whereas when you've got the 8 possibilities here, that can actually only be 16 different possible digits. So in order to store just this 2-digit number, we only need 18 states rather than the 20 states. And this gets bigger and better as we go on. We can store 3-digit numbers here, with again only 16 possibilities. And therefore, if we need that for a 3-digit number, we're going to need 30 different possibilities. Because again, 1 to 9 and 0 for every different digit. And binary just gets more and more efficient. As we add more and more digits on, that adds more and more possibilities, but when we're doing it in binary, it requires a smaller and smaller amount of possibilities. And that's important, because if you want to be able to store data and access it, you have to be able to store anything. And this is why binary is so good. Now, that's quite conceptual. Let's start talking realistic scenarios. Now, there's 2 different things to talk about here. There's bits, which is a 1 or a 0, but of course, 1 bit isn't particularly useful. It can only store 0 or 1. It's when you add multiple together that it becomes useful. And we have broadly decided that the minimum useful value is a byte, and that's 8 bits. 8 bits gives you 256 possibilities of things that you can put together. So by having 8 bits, you make 1 byte, and that is the smallest number. It's a character in a book. It's the smallest possibility that you can have. Now, 1 byte with a big B, is equal to 8 bits with a small b. And that's the conversion that we use. And then we can add these up. So 1 kilobyte is equal to 1024 bytes. Now that might seem a bit odd if you think about meters to kilometers and so on. They're always using 1,000. And that's kind of what they've done here, but of course 8 doesn't go by 1,000. So to make the maths easier, we do it instead by 1024. And computers are mathematical machines, so we want to make the maths as easy as possible. So unlike the normal kilo, meaning 1,000, in computing it means 1024. Equally, of course, if we take 1 megabyte, that's then having 1024 kilobytes, and we can go up and up and up from there. Excuse me. The question is, okay, we can make big numbers, that's great. We can make 256, 1 to 256 per byte. That's not useful though, right? Okay, sure, you can probably do some maths with that, but what if we want to store text, which is how almost all of the information that we want to store is done? Well, the answer is that storing data can be done with something like this. This is an ASCII table. See, When we take a byte of information, we can transform it even into a number. But that number that we have isn't actually the number that we want to get out. What we do is we apply it to this table, and this table has up to the 256 different possibilities. So what we do is we take a look and we actually read it off. And the bizarre part of this is if we go to, where are we over here? We have got the number 1 is actually the digit for 49. So if your byte adds up to 49, that outputs as a 1. This gives us more possibilities. It's all about being able to add more and more stuff into our different possibility space so that we can get more and more out. You'll also notice on there hexadecimal. That's a computing system or a numeric system that has 16 digits, which again, it's all about making the maths easier. The easier we make the maths, the better it works out. So the way that this works is we can take our binary code here, we've got some 1s and some 0s, and then we can convert that by using our simple mathematical method into a bunch of numbers. Now those numbers don't actually represent numbers. We then use our ASCII lookup table and we can then convert them into some hexadecimal if we want, because again computers like hexadecimal, which then can be converted into letters. So these letters here, binary code goes into our numbers, goes into our hexadecimal and comes out as the word York with a capital Y and an exclamation mark. And that is it. That is how all of the information we have is stored. We can get clever with it, but at the end of the day, all it is a bunch of 0s and 1s that we arrange in this particular order to turn it into text. There's ways then that we can turn text into pictures and pictures into video and all that kind of stuff, but fundamentally, that is it. That's all there is to it. Now, let's start thinking about file sizes. So if we take 1 kilobyte, right? 1 kilobyte is about a paragraph of text. That's 1,000 characters thereabouts. That's a pretty chunky paragraph of text, but that's a paragraph of text. If we multiply that by 1,000, we get to a 250-page book. Right? You've got 1,000 paragraphs. That's a decent chunk of a book. If we turn that up again by 1,000 times, that gets us to a gigabyte, which is about 2.5 hours of HD video streaming. Your mileage may vary on this, depending on what you consider HD to be, because I think HD now is like 4 generations behind what you actually get if you turn on the HD button. We can multiply this again by 1,000 times to 1 terabyte. And a terabyte is about the amount of storage that the average weird person uses. Now that's a specific academic term, which stands for Western, industrialised, educated, rich, brackets relatively speaking, and democratic. So that's everyone in this room. So we're talking about pretty much anyone who lives in the Western world. On average, we are using about 1 terabyte of personal storage. That doesn't necessarily mean you have 1 terabyte of pictures of your cat on your phone, but what it means is that all the accounts that you have with Facebook, Twitter, or all of these different social media sites, your home computer, your laptops, your tablets, between them all, they collate about 1 terabyte. Obviously, there are plenty of people who use less, and there's people like me, of course, who use a lot more. Then we go up from there. 1,024 terabytes takes us to 1 petabyte, and this is a truly staggering amount of data. This is half of all books that have ever been published. You've got 2 terabytes worth of books, that's pretty much everything that's ever been made. So that's an awful lot of text. That's just plain text, I might add. Of course, once you start adding formatting in, it starts to get a lot larger. If we increase that again, we take it up another 1,000 times to 1 exabyte of information. That is 1/5 of all of the words that have ever been spoken by humanity. That's obviously quite a lot. We take it even further to 1 zettabyte, and that is 1 bit per grain of sand on the planet. Which again, That's quite a lot of stuff. So now we have to ask, what is the problem? Why is it that I'm talking to you about it? This is also very interesting facts, you know, big numbers, very exciting. But why is it that I've decided that this is something you should know about and something that you should think about? And the problem is actually relatively simple. See, according to a survey from a couple of years ago, 328.77 million terabytes of data is created every single day. That's 330 petabytes. And if you remember, 1 petabyte is a fifth of all, so half of all books. Sorry. So we are writing 150-ish times all of the books that have ever been written in data every single day. That's 120 zettabytes per year in 2023. That is 120 times the amount of grains of sand there are, bits, per year. Worse than that, the amount of data that we are making is of course increasing. And not only is it increasing, the amount by which it is increasing is itself increasing. So we're already making loads and loads and loads of data, and we're making more of that data, and we're making more of that data more quickly every single year. We are producing a truly staggering quantity of data. Excuse me. Now, this is not to say, of course, that we are storing all of this information. Right? We can't store 120 zettabytes of data. We can't store 1 zettabyte, not even close. That data is being continually produced and destroyed all the time. When your computer is running at any given time, it's probably producing a couple of gigabytes of data every minute. It's just immediately writing over that data again and again and again. But we're still storing a lot of it. And we're storing more and more and more all the time. So the scale might not quite be as large, but it's still a problem. There's a lot of data, and we need to do something with it. So the question is, what's the future going to look like? How can we do it? And one way we want to think about it, actually, is if we think about science experiments, because everything's a bit more extreme if you do it with science. And we can think about this with the Large Hadron Collider. And the Large Hadron Collider produces about 15 petabytes of information per day. It's about 7.5 times the amount of books that have ever been made per day, and it keeps about 1 petabyte per day. And before the long shutdowns, in 2018, it was storing 600 petabytes of data. That's a truly staggering amount, and they had to do that by having an enormous distributed system right across the world. They have enormous data centres in different parts of the world that are storing bits of that data. No one place could even remotely hope to store it all. So they had to distribute that information. It cost billions of pounds to be able to do that. Because of course that information needs to be accessed. This is peanuts. See, we started building the square kilometre array in about the 1990s. And the square kilometre array is still a good couple of decades from really getting online. But what it is, it's a load of telescopes across a giant expanse of Australia that are going to be getting loads of information from space. How much information from space? About 120 exabytes per year that we keep. It will be taking in 330 petabytes per day. That is about how much data we are producing globally at the moment. The expansion rate is enormous. One of the use cases, one of the reasons that the square kilometre array was funded was because they said, well, computing's just got to get better. And the fact that we've got to make this thing is going to push computing further. So that's the question. How do we store these truly enormous amounts of data? Not only because, as Chris said, your pictures are getting larger, how do you store them on your phone? How do you store all of the data that your work might be producing? But how do we store all this stuff that these enormous computers, these enormous science experiments are using? Some of you might be saying to yourself, well, it's very easy. I just put it on the cloud. Right? If I've not got enough room on my phone, all I do is I pop it on the cloud, not a problem. Of course, the problem is the cloud doesn't exist. There is no such thing as the cloud, it is just somebody else's computer. And you would be surprised by the defence contractors that I've spoken to that are very annoyed by this statement because they think, oh, I'll just put it on. And these are people that make missiles. You'd think they'd be rather concerned about putting it on someone else's computer. Now, a cloud storage system is basically just a specially dedicated computer which is almost nothing but storage. Your computer has a load of different parts. It has CPU, GPU, storage, motherboards, all sorts of bits to make your computer work. The cloud is just a bunch of computers that are almost exclusively storage, as much storage as they can make, and then they rent that storage out to you. When you pay a couple of pounds a month for your Apple storage, what it is it's sitting somewhere on one of these computers in a massive, massive bank of computers somewhere else in the world. And the amount of these is increasing. So this survey here was saying by 2022, about 60% of corporate data, all the big companies, is stored elsewhere. They don't have their own banks of computers anymore, they just rent someone else's. It's cheaper and more efficient to put it elsewhere, so the amount of these data centres is increasing enormously. The US has nearly 3,000 and there are more being built all the time. This is good in some ways, because it means that when Apple creates a new iPhone, they don't really have to worry about it. Because they know that anyone that's going to want to store a lot of pictures is going to do it on the cloud. And they can just rent that from somewhere else. Or if you buy a new laptop, they can sell it to you with a very small storage, because if you really care, you're going to put it on the cloud. So the consumer market, the market to you or me, doesn't really matter anymore. Which is a really bizarre place to be in, because now the technology is driven by these data centres. It's what do they want? What do they need? How can they do it? Now, before we go on and talk about how we're going to solve this problem, we need to take a step back and describe what does our current technology look like? How do we actually store the data? Excuse me, sorry. Basically, there are a million different possibilities. Binary is such a good system because any way that you can make that 1, 0, any way that you can have two different possibilities, you can write binary and then you can do whatever you want with it. You could write an entire book in binary purely by using alternating cheese and ham sandwiches. This one is a cheese sandwich, this one is a ham sandwich, that one's a cheese, that one's a cheese. You can add up your numbers from there. So if you wanted to go along, because what's important is you need to be able to read and write it. And you can do that by having a look. Is it a cheese or is it a ham sandwich? I want to change it from 1 to a 0, take out the cheese, put in the ham. Anything you can think of, shiny stones, different coloured buttons, whatever you want could be a way of storing information. There are 100 million different techniques. Different companies are coming up with variations all the time, but effectively there are two main methods of storage that we use at the moment. And they are magnetism and transistors. And pretty much everything else is either a niche technique, which has a very particular purpose, or is some variation that some marketing guru has managed to suggest is actually separate. So let's take a look at these. And we'll start with magnetism. Magnets have two directions. They have a north and they have a south. And we could consider them to be either polarised up or polarised down, depending on is it north pointing up or is it south pointing up. Great. There you go. Those are your two different directions. And what we can do is we simply take a line of these magnets, some of them pointing up, some of them pointing down, and then we can run another magnet along it, run a compass along it, and then that will detect what orientation are all of the little bits underneath it in. So we take our compass, run it across, map out what orientation our compass goes into, therefore you know what orientation these bottom bits are into. Voila. That's it. It really is as simple as that. You take a bunch of magnets, you make them north-south or south-north, and then you test which way are they up. It's as easy as that. Now, it's slightly more complicated in the fact that actually, to make it easier, rather than having it be, is it pointing up or is it pointing down, we know the spacing. So what we ask is not, is it up or down, we ask, has it changed? Because it's a lot easier to detect a change than it is to detect what something is. Think about it like trying to see an animal in the garden. It looks different from the surroundings, but if it's moving, it's much, much easier to spot. Exactly the same principle, just using electronics. So, what we do is we look, does it change? If yes, it's a 1. If no, it's a 0. And then everything else builds up from there. All of the code, all of the stuff, it's all just what direction is our arrow pointing in. Excuse me. Now what we do here is we use hard drives. And hard drives are sometimes called spinning rust because they are literally just plates of iron which have loads of these little separate magnets inside them. And when you spin the plate, you move the head to the bit that you want, and it reads it. Was that an up? Was that a down? Was that an up? Was that a down? Give you the 1s and 0s, read it out. If you want to change, all you do is you take another magnet and use that to change the orientation. Obviously this happens very, very quickly, because if you want to be able to read your information, you need to be able to do this really, really quickly, but it is, once again, as simple as that. What direction is our magnet pointing? Gives us a 1 or a 0. The main other option are transistors. And transistors are absolutely fantastic materials, and we could go into a lot of details about what transistors are, and if you're that interested, I have a second-year course in semiconductors within the department. But basically, they are electrical switches. That's all they are. You've got 3 pins, a circuit goes in this pin, comes out the other pin, and the one in the middle decides, is the circuit on or off? By applying a voltage to that middle pin, you can either make it so that the electrons can flow through, or they can't. It's as easy as that, and therefore you make it so that one of them is on, and 0 is off. If the electricity flows, it's a 1. If the electricity doesn't flow, it's a 0. Again, it's very, very simple in its conception. All you're doing is a lot of very simple things very quickly. That's all computers do. Computers can actually do 2 things. They can add, and they can check that they added correctly. Everything else, all of your videos, all of these magical scientific computing marvels, these models of everything, it's just a lot of adding. And all the subtraction that they do, that's just adding in reverse. The multiplying is just more adding in weird ways. Everything comes from these very, very simple calculations, which is why it's as simple as an on or off switch. Now, our limiting factor here then is, well, how small can you make a transistor? The more stuff that you can fit in, the smaller you can make your materials. And that is basically all we have done for the last 50 years of computing. Right? If we want to get more storage into a space, well, it's simple. You either make the magnets smaller, or you make the transistors smaller. And that's where we can go from something like this, 160 gigabytes. This one is a 2011 hard drive. Right, we take that, that's got 160 gigabytes in it. 4 years later, this is a 1 terabyte. This is about 10 times more storage than this. These are exactly the same. They're made by the same manufacturer. At the time of release, they were about the same price. All that's happened is the little magnetic bits in here are even littler in this one. That's all they had to do. And I'd hoped to bring it with me today, but unfortunately I wasn't able to get access to it. I've got one of these from 1989 that is this big, comes in a big canister, and is a whopping 8 megabytes. It works in exactly the same way. There is no difference in the fundamental technology between this and some of the early ones which stored tiny, tiny amounts. All that's different is that they've made the bits smaller and smaller. I am, of course, going over rather a lot of detail and years of research and development and literally billions of pounds of technology, but fundamentally they work in the same way. Problem is, we can't keep doing this forever. And in fact, the limit is maybe only 10 years away. We can't get things much smaller. You see, transistors are now down to 3 nanometers in size. And in fact, I think it was AMD the other day, they bought up it was Apple, sorry, that bought up all of the capability for 2 nanometer transistors for like the next 5 years. 3 nanometers is like a few tens of atoms. You can't get much smaller than that. Even within the smallest conception, you could only have 3 atoms, right? One where it goes in, one where it comes out, and one in the middle. So at the absolute most, and that's not even talking about quantum nonsense, at the absolute most, we could only get 1 magnitude smaller. And then we've just hit the limit. You can't get any smaller. So yeah, just a handful of atoms. This is how we've been going so far, and you can see that as they get smaller and smaller, that tail is levelling off. And eventually, it's going to hit a hard barrier. We can get clever, but we can't beat physics. Magnets, it's a little bit more weird, actually. What happens is, your magnetic components, as they get smaller and smaller, they become more likely to flip. So what should be an up can sometimes just become a down. Again, it's a natural, physical process that they should be an up, and occasionally they can just randomly switch to being a down. And that's a problem, obviously, right? That's changing your data. You don't want that. If you store your information and there's a chance that every minute half of that information might just switch, that's going to totally ruin any of your data. It's no good for It's no good for storage anymore whatsoever. So that's perfectly natural, so we can't make them too much smaller, because the smaller they get, the more likely they are to flip. So the question is, what are we going to do about it? And there's 2 answers to this. There's the near future, and then there's the far future. And we'll start, of course, with the near future, because it's not nearly as exciting. Now, the near future, one way we could look to solve this, and this is something that now exists. So this is something that I worked on during my PhD, and you can go and, well, actually, you can't go and buy one, but the data centres can go and buy these. HAMR, it's called Heat-Assisted Magnetic Recording. And the basic idea is, well, okay, if we want to make our magnets stop flipping, what if we just make the material harder? What if we make it so that naturally the material is less likely to flip? Set it in stone, won't want to flip, that's fine, great. That's a brilliant idea until you want to flip it. It's all very well and good to chisel some information into stone, but if you want to change it later, that's not much use. So we need to make it so that it's soft enough that we can flip it when we want, but hard enough that it's not going to flip on its own. And the way we go about this, or one of the possible ways to do it, there's lots of competing arguments about how best to do it, but one of them is to use a laser. We fire a laser at the material like this, so the laser is fired onto the bit, and if you fire a laser at something, it gets hot. Think about a squash ball, or think about plasticine. When you start moulding plasticine, it's quite hard. But as you get some heat in there, as you've been working it for a little while and it warms up, it becomes much, much easier to mould, and then when you leave it again, it stiffens back up. Pretty much the same idea here. If we heat up our magnetic bits with this laser, it makes them easier to shape. You can set them into the position that you want, and then as it moves on, they cool back down again and lock into the position that we want. And we can do this. This is something that is being done right now. It is purchasable, it's quite expensive, it's only going to be for higher end people that really, really need large amounts of storage, but it's something that we can do. Just using plasticine to lock in those, plasticine principles to lock in those positions. Longer term, there's ideas of using microwaves to be able to do something very similar. So using short blasts of microwaves to be able to flip them so that they naturally couldn't flip, but because you're blasting them with so much energy, they'll then tumble for you. But of course, that means that you've got to blast your system with microwaves. So there's a lot of things you've got to think about there. And there's various other principles that people are taking and different ways we might be able to get over this barrier. But fundamentally, it's the question of how can we make it so it flips when we want, but doesn't flip when we don't. It's a different question for semiconductors, because of course semiconductors, we're reaching the limit of physics, right? Physically, we can still make magnetic bits smaller, semiconductors, not so much. So the idea here is actually to start using three-dimensional architecture, right? For transistors, why not just stack them on top of each other? If the problem is that you can't make them individually any smaller, why not put them on top? Now, this already technically happens, right? When you buy a storage system, like these ones in here, if I was to crack this open, it wouldn't just have one disk in it, it probably has 3 or 4 different disks in it. But that's not actually 3D. What that is a series of 2Ds stacked on top of each other, which isn't actually the same thing. Because if you stack multiple 2Ds on top of each other, you've still got to put in all of the stuff around it. In a solid-state storage device, the actual storage part of it might only take up half of the size of the box, because you've got to have all the other stuff in there, all the electronics that reads it and sorts it and does all of that kind of stuff. So what we want is a truly three-dimensional system, rather than just taking a bunch of 2D systems and stacking them on top of each other. Now, research is ongoing. There's a whole bunch of different people, a whole bunch of different companies looking at what is the best way to stack these chips on top of each other, to make it truly three-dimensional architecture with like these wires going through the system itself. So each layer, every time you get a new layer in, it multiplies capacity. But within a 3D architecture, it doesn't really add much in the way of width. See, this here is only so thick because all of the architecture around the storage is so thick. We can only fit sort of 3 or 4 platters in here, but if you could actually just put the platters on top of each other, you could maybe fit 10, and that's because this is the magnetic storage. In the same space, you could fit probably hundreds, if not thousands, of these stacks on top of each other. Because remember, if they're only 3 nanometers in size that way, they're probably only like 10 nanometers in size that way. And if you stack a couple thousand of those on top of each other, that's still only like a millimeter, maybe even a micrometer, right? These are tiny, tiny, tiny. So if you can work out how to stack them on top of each other, we can make them enormous in 3D, so your box size doesn't change, but your storage skyrockets. Another way we can look at this is spintronics. This is sort of the future. It was the future about 20 years ago. It's still the future. We're working on it. So spintronics is the idea that, well, magnets work by being made of smaller magnets. Right? If you have a big magnet, it's because the material in it is magnetic. And if you ask why is the material in it magnetic, we say that's because it's made of loads of domains, and all of those domains are magnetic. You ask, well, why are those domains magnetic? Well, that's because they're made of little magnetic grains. You say, well, why are they magnetic? And the answer is atoms. Individual atoms, and in fact, individual electrons can be magnetic. And that forms the basis of all magnetism. It's all just individual electrons and some atoms that have what we call a dipole to them. And, okay, if the smallest magnetic component is an electron, which is very, very small indeed, why don't we use them? And that's it. That's the idea of spintronics. The idea that we can use the smallest possible magnetic component, which is an electron, which is smaller than an atom. So if you can harness that, that's going to be an incredible amount of storage. An electron is like the smallest thing that exists, pretty much. In fact, in some conceptions of physics, it doesn't actually even have a size. So, great, let's use them. We use the smallest magnetic component possible. That's great, but it's really hard. Like, we've been working at this now for well over 30 years, and there's some really cool ideas. So this is racetrack memory. This is the idea that you can make these little magnetic domains out of small numbers of atoms, and you pass them through, and then you can read the data there. There's these cool things called spin torque, spintronics. In fact, you can buy these, but the idea is that you use electrons to bounce off other electrons, which changes their spin. All these things called skyrmions, which I can only define as magical shapes that the universe likes, because basically what it is if you put electrons in a certain orientation, they just stay there. That shouldn't happen, realistically. And the way that you make them is like the same way that you make donuts in a fairground ride. You put them through a particular shaped hole, and they just plop out the other end. And then they're just happy. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. They're just magical universe shapes. I've read papers on these, and honestly, they don't have a better answer. So, spintronics is this really great idea. What if we use electrons as those fundamental bits? That is a great idea. The problem is that's really hard. So, we're working on it. We'll get there in the end, hopefully. Or at least, hopefully for my career. Now, the next question then is the far future. What is it that's going to save us in the future? How is it that, sure, these ideas are great, and maybe they'll give us another couple of orders of magnitude, but if we're going to keep increasing the amount of storage that we're using more and more and more and more, we're going to need even better ideas. So, what's in the pipeline? What are those blue sky ideas? One of them is DNA storage. And this comes from a very simple idea. In your body is information, right? You are coded using the base pairs of DNA, and all of that makes all of biology happen. Right? It all comes from everything in the biological world, fundamentally comes from two things, one of which is geometry, which is the same as the magical universal shapes, but the other thing is these coding base pairs. By having them, they're kind of their own sort of binary type system. By having those in different orientations, that encodes everything to do with life. So what if we just use that? Like, it's really efficient, right? We could get to 455 exabytes of data per gram. If you take a gram of dried out DNA from your body, that has 455 exabytes of information in it. That's an enormous number. Additionally, quick replication, right? Your body is making new DNA all the time. Every time a little skin cell falls off, your body's making a new one to replace it. So we're constantly, our bodies are making it. You could use your body as a USB drive, right? You take an injection that's got your new PowerPoint on it, you go over to the computer, you take a bit of blood out, you stick that in, that's got your entire computer stored right throughout your body. It's also change resistant. Was it the Millennium Project, or was it even earlier than the Millennium Project? Probably some of the older audience members. Remember, it was an old BBC project with these huge discs, the Doomsday Project, that's what it's called, the Doomsday Project. Some people are getting some nods from the Doomsday Project. They built them onto these enormous giant discs in, was it like the 80s or the 70s or something like that? And the problem is, we can't read that information anymore. We don't have a way of reading these old big discs. And then someone put it on a website, they did a lot of work to do that, and the website's now down because he died. Right? One of the problems we have is that the ways we store data change all the time. The fundamentals might remain the same. Fundamentally, there's no difference between a floppy disk and a hard drive. Right? They still work on the same principle of having those little magnetic bits. But good luck coming in with a floppy disk and trying to find some way to read that. DNA, it's been the same for millions of years, right? Very simple. It's not going to change. So it's got all of these things going for it. The only thing it's got going against it is that it's absolutely rubbish, right? It might be that you can fit 455 exabytes per gram, but it's not very useful if you can't choose what to read. Right? That's like taking all of the letters in the English language, doing them on tiny pieces of paper and sticking them in a sack, and then trying to get a book out from it. It's not very useful. Quick replication is great, but your DNA is constantly changing and mutating. Up to 10% of the information in your DNA and within a particular strand could be changed from one replication to the next. Your body's got a lot of checks and balances that keep you going, but effectively that's what aging is, right? As you get older, that is, to a larger or lesser extent, because your DNA copying gets worse and worse over time. So that's not great for our data storage. Change resistant, sure, but that's also largely because it's not a particularly great way of being able to store and retrieve that information. So it's a good idea and people are working on it, but that might be a lot of money going down a bin, in my opinion. So what are some slightly better ideas? So one of them is silica glass. And actually, this one's for a very particular problem. So this is the idea of how can we store lots of information and how can we store it long term. So this here, this chap is holding a little bit of glass, silica glass, that contains 7 terabytes of information in the same size as a DVD. Even a modern Blu-ray DVD, that's about 50 gigabytes. So we're storing a lot more information in a very small amount of space. And of course you can see it's portable, right? That's also quite useful. And this is done by making laser printing into the shapes of silica. So you take a piece of glass and you burn in a bunch of furrows into the middle of the glass. You might have seen it before. They're very popular for a little while in the early 2000s. Right, you've got a piece of glass and it's got like the Leaning Tower of Pisa has been burnt into the middle of it with little spots, or the Eiffel Tower, or something like that. It's basically the same idea, but a bit higher tech. By having what we call these voxels, these three-dimensional voxels, you can store loads of binary information into these little bits of silica glass. And the problem this one is actually trying to solve is the idea of bit rot. This hard drive here is now about 10 years old. It might not work anymore. The hard drives that we have are rated to about 10 years. If you have a hard drive that's older than 10 years that has important information on it, probably want to upgrade it by now. This happens all the time. Every data format storage will fail in the end. When we're talking about those bits changing, that happens even with bigger bits. It just takes longer. Most ones are rated to about 50 years, but it'll happen earlier than that. Old magnetic tape, old videotapes, over the years, they will degrade, right? That's bit rot. The idea that the information we're storing in some way or another degrades over time. With solid state drives using transistors will fail. Simple idea like this. The idea here is because it's burnt into the glass, it will not change. It's rated to over 10,000 years. The final possibility for the future, how we're going to store information, comes from quantum computing. Now, I'm not going to get into the details of quantum computing, but quantum computing has this idea called quantum supremacy. And this is the idea when the point was reached, wherein a quantum computer was better at doing something than a normal computer. When was it that a quantum computer could do something that a supercomputer couldn't? This is disputed. There's a lot of corporate wrangling over who was the first to do it and by how much. Again, I won't go into the details, but 2019, generally accepted, Google Sycamore. They created this quantum computing chip here that used 53 qubits to perform a task in less than an hour that it said would take a normal supercomputer of equivalent expense 10,000 years to perform. IBM said that was absolute rubbish, it would only take 3 days, but then the next year they did release their own and try and claim quantum supremacy. So, as I say, there's some corporate wrangling over who did it first. But the idea here is that quantum computing is now better than normal computing. And that is a paradigm shift. And the reason that that is a paradigm shift is because quantum computers use qubits. Now, again, I'm not going to go too far into the details here because, to be frank, I don't understand them. But the thing that we have here is a qubit is not a thing. It's not a bit in the same way that magnetic bits are or that transistors are. Qubits don't actually exist. Rather, it is a position. It is a possibility that something can be one thing or the other. This is your classic Schrodinger's cat. This is the idea that Schrodinger's cat is either alive or dead, but it can be both at the same time. And it's only when you check inside the box, is Schrodinger's cat dead? So our question here now is our qubit a 1 or a 0? And our answer could be both. And it's only when you check that it becomes a 1 or a 0. And importantly, it could be how you check that determines if it's a 1 or a 0. And suddenly, we go right back to the start of the talk with possibility space. See, at the start, what I was talking about was when you want to display a single digit, you have, in our decimal system, 10 different possibilities. But you choose 1. Then, when we have the binary system with 8 bytes, you have 16 different possibilities, which could produce 256 different results. See, here's the thing. With a qubit, because it could be either, it is all of the possibilities simultaneously. And this gives us what we call a 2n scaling. This means 1 gigabyte of information requires just 26 qubits. And if you want to increase that to a terabyte, you need just 36 qubits with a small b. 1 petabyte, 46 qubits. 1 exabyte, 56. 1 zettabyte. 1 possibility state for every single grain of sand in the world could fit on just 66 qubits. So if a qubit could be made in the same way as a magnetic bit that we have at the moment, this 1 terabyte, this contains 8 trillion or 8 quadrillion bits. This information could be stored on just 36 qubits. All of the grains of sand in just 66 qubits. I'll step us back here and say, obviously it's not that easy, right? If we could ever actually fully utilise this is a totally separate question. But it is a question that we are working on. It is a question that we are making enormous amounts of progress in, and quantum computers are getting better all the time. If we crack it, and then this is a big if, at the moment quantum computers have quantum supremacy, but only in very limited cases. They only work better if you're really specific about the question that you're asking. But if we crack it, if we make it so that every single computer could be replaced by a quantum computer, we don't need to worry anymore. Just 66 bits could store more information than we could possibly know what to do with. And hey, if we use more than we can conceive of right now, fine, add another 10 bits. You've just multiplied that by 1,000, and just keep going and going and going. This would make the entire rest of my talk completely useless, which is probably why it's a good job it's at least 30 years away. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, James. We have some time for some questions. I know I've got some, but it's not about me. It's about you. So there's someone over here. Looks like they have a question. Wait until I come over with the microphone so that we can catch your sound.
My question is probably very simple because some of this passed over my head, having failed GCSE maths or O-level maths. But when I read about these data centres which we have now, in terms of the environmental cost, is pretty enormous. They use up an enormous amount of electricity, and I don't beyond the data centres, all the things you're talking about, maybe they'll use up much less electricity, so it'll be much better for the environment. But I'd like to know a bit about the problem now with these data centres, which are, thousands all over the world.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an amazing question.
Really good question.
So there's 2 answers to that. And the first one is that the data centres that we are using now are far, far, far more efficient at using energy than you would be if you stored it yourself. For the very simple reason of all of that storage needs electricity, and electricity costs money. Right? So it's the same way as if you live in the city, you're going to be far more efficient in terms of your carbon footprint than if you live in the countryside. Because It's just more efficient. You can take the bus because you don't need to drive because you're near stuff, and you can walk and all of these sorts of things. So living in the city is more efficient in terms of your carbon footprint. For exactly the same reason, storing your data on these data servers is far more efficient in terms of your carbon footprint because they are incentivized to keep that as low as possible. If for no other reason, then it means it's cheaper for them and they make more money. Right? There's certain market forces.
It always comes down to that.
It always comes down to that.
It's all capitalism.
So it is better for your carbon footprint to store it there, but you're right? There's loads of these things, and the question is, do we need to store that information in the first place? That's a very big question, and the answer we have broadly, as a society, decided on is yes. Maybe you could start some activism about that if you're really concerned, but there are probably bigger fish to fry. Bitcoin, for a start. Now,
that was last year's talk.
That was last year's talk, yeah. The other way to take that is actually there's a lot of data centres which are really trying. Now, this is a little bit tooting York's horn, but York moved all of its supercomputing to a data centre in Sweden that works entirely off natural renewable energies. It's in Sweden, right? They've got loads of that kind of stuff. So it's all wind power or water power, and all of the excess heat that it generates is used to produce wood pellets for extra fuel. So it's better than 100% carbon neutral. Now, that is an anomaly. Right, and I think there's only maybe a couple data centres that do that, and York is one of their first big clients, but that's kind of like a trying to move towards that kind of eco-efficiency and that kind of stuff. Now, again, if you're an activist, there's lots of questions you can ask about greenwashing and so on and so forth. That's not an argument I want to get into, but purely by market forces, it's more efficient, energetically speaking, and therefore carbon footprint. And there are people who are trying to make that move. Again, be it cynically, be it through genuine environmental consciousness, people are trying to move that way. And in fact, I think pretty much every data centre, if they could switch to green energy, would. So that's maybe not so much of a question for the data centres, so much as the larger societal movement that the data centres will follow. And I mean, they're constantly moving around trying to find the cheapest energy. And the cheapest energy is generally going to be green energy. So, that kind of thing.
I think there's a space here for activism, which is to push for regulation, to say it's got to be green energy. You've got to do this. And then corporations will go, okay, fine, we'll fall into line. If we have to, there's no choice.
Yeah.
Other questions? I think there's one here. I'll start over here, and then I'll come back to you.
Am I right in assuming that, I'm pretty sure that a large component of the cost of running a data center, or certainly the environmental impact, is from cooling. And I believe Microsoft did something where they created a data center that they stuck in the ocean, or something, and that was quite successful, I believe.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. The big question is, how do you cool stuff? And one of the answers that they found is stick it in Sweden. Right, or stick it in Norway, somewhere that's naturally cold. Microsoft took a data centre, put it in a sealed container and put it at the bottom of the ocean, because of course it's cool down there and it doesn't, yes, you are technically warming the water, but it's by such a fractional amount that it really doesn't matter, and that was really, really successful. The problem is getting the data out, and what if something goes wrong? But there's possibilities, right? There's a really cool one that, again, tooting York's horn, but York is getting involved with, where they're looking at using mine water in Durham and heating up the mine water by using the excess heat, and then that mine water can then be used to generate electricity elsewhere. I don't quite know the full details. There's lots of them that have greenhouses attached. So they just pump their heat out into a big tropical greenhouse and they grow things in that. Again, how much of this is PR and that kind of thing? You could make a lot of debates, but it's the same idea as, again, any commercial system. We're generating a lot of heat. Can we use that heat for something? Can we make money off that heat? So there is a push towards using that for something useful as well.
I've really hung on to the microphone because I've got another question.
Oh, that's cheeky. Go on, very quickly.
And that's, I believe a cube doesn't simply have two states, does it? Like a bit would. Has it got multiple states, potential states?
So yeah, it a qubit is in a superposition of two states, which is to say it is not in one or the other, it is simultaneously in both. And you are right, it could simultaneously be in hundreds of different possible states, but for that you would really need to take the fourth year quantum mechanics course to even begin to understand that, and I stopped at third year, so I really couldn't begin to answer that question.
Listen, I am really sorry. We are going to have to wrap it up there. But, gentleman over here. Well, okay, let's push it past the half mark really quickly. But then, final question.
Yeah, I have a personal question. So, like most people, I have photographs and videos and written content on my computer at home. Given today's technology, what's the best way that I can store my information for future generations? You know, is it best to store it on an SSD drive, a hard HD drive, or burn it onto an old-fashioned DVD? What's the best way to store it so that it's not destroyed for future
that
generations?
is a great question. You can buy these. I'll tell you what we'll do. I can see there's some more hands that have gone up. I will be out there after this, and we can have a chat with the questions that we don't get to. Basically, the best thing that you can do at the moment is to put it on a good quality hard drive. There are some hard drives out there which are specifically long-lasting hard drives, but even then, that's only going to last sort of maybe up to 40 years, and it needs to be an ongoing process. There is no such thing as at the moment as something that you can just stick it on, forget about it forever. Lots of hard drives are good. I mean, I've had the same hard drive, I shouldn't admit this, but I've had the same hard drive now for about 15 years and it's fine. But it could catastrophically fail one day, and certainly in these data centres, they have racks of these things failing every day, and they have whole systems on how to do backups and that kind of stuff. So it does depend on how often you access it. The more often you access it, the more likely it is to fail. They are mechanical systems. So if you're not going to physically access it much, hard drives are better. If they're going to be accessed frequently, solid-state drives are better because they contain no moving parts. And obviously a moving part is more likely to fail than an electrical part. But also the bits are more likely to last longer than the transistors are. So it's about what you're specifically going to do with it. In fact, magnetic tape, so we're talking like old reels tape, is making a comeback and is being used in data centres as long-term archival final, backup, because it is very, very slow to use, but it's also super cheap. So, magnetic tape is possibly going to be one of the best ways to do it, because it can actually last a really long time, especially with the new stuff they're making. So my advice, go on Amazon, search for long-term hard drive. That should probably keep for about 40 years, and then, or however long it's rated for, and then it's going to be up to whoever's got it in 40 years' time to update it again.
Hand it on to the kids and the grandkids. That's their problem. Give them the best that you can now. Listen, we need to wind it up there, but as James said, he'll be sticking around to answer a couple of other questions outside. Can we please give it up for Dr. James Lees? Fabulous talk. Thank you for coming out this evening, and the festival's still going on until Thursday, I believe. So get out there and get into some of the other talks that are going on. Thank you very much for coming along tonight. It's great to see you.